everyone, and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas, a Literature for a Changing Planet panel. I'm Dr. Sarah Bazan. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of York's Leverhulme Center for Anthropocene Biodiversity, and I'm also a member of the Department of English. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to this panel and also to introduce Martin Puchner. Martin Puchner is the Byron and Anita Wien Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. He is a prize-winning and best-selling author whose books include The Language of Thieves, My Family's Obsession with a Secret Code the Nazis Tried to Eliminate, and The Written World, The Power of Stories to Shape People, History, Civilization. He is the general editor of the Norton Anthology of World Literature and lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'll let Martin take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, the York Festival of Ideas, and you, the audience. I'm going to share my screen so you have something more interesting to look at than just myself. So I want to talk about literature, really world literature and climate change. And that's based on a short little book that I just published by the same title, Literature for a Changing Planet. And the premise of this book and the event today is that probably one that a lot of the attendance people who go to the York Festival of Ideas will agree with, namely that we humans are a storytelling species, that stories are one of the main ways in which we orient ourselves in the world, in which we make sense of the world, in which we understand our relation to the world and to other people. And so this is true, I think, generally in many domains, but it strikes me that it's particularly pertinent in the case of climate change. And the reason is that, we broadly seen in the last 40 years that climate scientists have gotten better and better, more sophisticated with their models in predicting climate change. But it's also become clearer and clearer that it's very hard to get people and organizations to change based simply on scientific facts. So storytelling, I think, is one of the modes in which we can get at deep-seated motivations, deep-seated patterns of thought and belief. And so this is why I believe, and other people too, that storytelling and understanding storytelling, getting more sophisticated about storytelling, has a role to play in thinking about and addressing the consequences of climate change. Now, I'm not the first person to observe this. I think a lot of people would agree with the statement. And in response to that, there's been a recent flourishing of literature about climate change, fiction and nonfiction. There's a field called eco-criticism or environmental humanities that tries to tease out the relationship between climate change or environmental change and storytelling in the humanities. Where I come in and what I understand is sort of my contribution has to do with time scales. So most of the people who care about literature and climate change focus on very recent literature. And, for good reasons, the awareness of climate change has grown, of course, in the last couple of decades. We've only known about climate change for about 40 years. So in many ways, it does make sense to focus on that. But I have started to study literature on a much broader time scale. Most scholars do study literature in sort of chunks of decades or maybe a century and a half. So 70, maybe to 100 and 150 years. And that's a great time scale, but I have come to believe that there are certain things about literature we can, and therefore storytelling, we can only understand if we look at much larger time scales, including thousands of years, or to just mention the broadest that I'll be addressing today, 4,000 years. That's for as long as we have had a written record of stories. So before I want to delve into the environmental aspects of it, I just want to spend a few moments talking a little bit about what the advantages are to studying literature on that broadest time scale. And I think the main advantage is that it's only at that scale that you can ask or understand very fundamental aspects of written stories, including these fundamental questions. When was writing invented? How often was writing invented? What is the broad shape of literary history? And so on and so forth. Now, I've been studying literature and teaching literature for many decades, and I myself had never really asked these questions, let alone been in the position to answer them, because I, like most of my colleagues who study literature, had focused on the last 150 years mostly of literature. And this changed when I was asked about 15 years ago to come in as the editor of the Norton Anthology of World Literature that Sarah mentioned a moment ago. It's one of these huge anthologies that go from the very beginning of writing to the present in 6 volumes. And of course, I was working with a large team of people. And I very quickly realized that I thought I was pretty well read. I realized quickly that I was not well read, that there's so much I didn't know. So working with this team, I started to piece together that larger story of literature that scholars and people working in literature rarely, grapple with, and started to answer some of these fundamental questions. So just to give you a sense of some of the sort of touchstones of that broader story of literature. So the first full writing system was developed in Mesopotamia, today's Iraq, about 5,000 years ago, and was written on clay. These are the cuneiform clay tablets. And one of the first texts in world literature, therefore, unsurprisingly, comes from that region, the Epic of Gilgamesh, set in Uruk, in today's Iraq. One of the first and fundamental texts of world literature has only been rediscovered about 150 years ago. To address the second question, how often was writing invented? I became really fascinated by the question because all the early writing cultures that are well known, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, the Near East, Greece, they all are in the same landmass. So it's possible, it's very hard to prove one way or the other, but it's possible that somehow the idea of writing emerged maybe only once in Mesopotamia and then traveled to these other parts of Eurasia. But we know for certain that humans invented this all-important technology at least twice, because there exists this one completely independent literary tradition, and that's in Middle America, the Mayan writing tradition, one of the few full writing traditions in the Americas before contact with Europe. And so this is, I think, but not well known enough. The Popol Vuh is the great sort of epic story of that tradition. And it's almost like a scientific control experiment. So it became very interesting to me that there's this one independent tradition, and you can hold these different traditions next to each other and think about their similarities and differences. The other topic that emerged for me from that bird's eye view of literature was the relationship between writing and storytelling, and oral storytelling. And one of the texts that I'm always trying to proselytize for is the Epic of Sunjata, a West African epic in what today is Mali, that commemorates a medieval kingdom of Mali, but that was transmitted orally until the 20th century. And I was very fortunate in my work on the anthology to work with the American scholar David Conrad, who collaborated with a Mande singer, Condé, and produced this written version of the epic. And it's a process very similar to what happened with Homer, for example, 800 BC. So this dynamic of oral storytelling and writing continues to this day. So this bigger picture of literature is something I try to capture in a book I published recently, The Written World, that Sarah also mentioned. And it's really that larger research project and book project that now brought me to essentially take that broad view, that huge canon of written stories, and bring it to bear on this question of climate change. So this led to this book, Literature for Changing Planet. And in it, I essentially tried to do two things. The first thing is to say what I also mentioned initially, is to basically use this incredible archive record of written stories and ask, where do the stories that are floating around in our heads about civilization, about the relationship to the environment come from? And the answer is they come from really far back, including the earliest literatures. And to just give you sort of one example, one mini case study, I want to focus on the Epic of Gilgamesh. As I said, the earliest text, large, long texts really of world literature. And it's striking to me just how relevant, how urgent this text speaks to our current moment. And I'll add a speculation as to why in a second. So why is this text, why should we bother to read this text, think about this text when it comes to climate change today, 3,000-4,000 years later? Well, the first reason, perhaps the one that if any of you have heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the one that comes to mind right away, is that it's the earliest version of the story of the flood that also appears in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. And it's striking, the story is very, very similar in many of its particulars. So it's clear that they derive from the same source. And it's a story that has shaped a lot of imagination about climate change, and sort of, especially in the more apocalyptic mode, the end of the world. Any number of Hollywood disaster movies are based on the story of the flood, one way or another. And it's interesting to compare these two versions of the story of the flood, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Old Testament. And as I mentioned, many of the details are very, very similar. But what's different is sort of the framing of it. In the biblical version, as many of you will know, the flood is really punishment for sins humans have committed, not following God's commandments. And so God experiences, I guess you could call it, creator's remorse, and wants to wipe out his creation, with the exception of Noah and his family and whatever Noah brings onto the ark. Now, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's also the gods bring about the flood, but it's less framed as in this sort of absolute moral terms of sin and punishment. There is a punishment aspect to it, but it's much less general. And there's the way the gods, and of course we have many gods here in the Epic of Gilgamesh, not just one god, the way they discuss and debate the flood, and not all gods agree that even a flood should be sent. The main purpose seems to be less punishment than, I suppose you could say, population control. Humans have become too numerous, and so that's when the gods try to send a flood. And because the story of the flood is still shapes so much of a contemporary imagination, I think it's interesting to think about which of these two versions is more useful today. Now, you could say the biblical punishment for sins is the more useful one, because after all, we are the cause of climate change. We have brought this upon ourselves in one way or another. So maybe this sin and punishment scenario is the right one. Though I also feel like there's too much emphasis on that. And even contemporary environmental writing tends to, for my purposes, perhaps too moralistic. And maybe that sometimes creates a backlash. So I've started to think that maybe the more engineering-based version in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where it's more about population control, is perhaps better today. And the sort of moralism of the biblical story maybe is misguided. Well, maybe we can chat about that towards the end. But just to stay with the Epic of Gilgamesh for one more moment, the flood story actually does not play a big role in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's just an interpolated tale. It's a story. A character tells another story. So it's not part of the main plot of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But once we are sort of sharpened our senses for the environment in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's sort of amazing what else comes into view. Now, those of you who have read the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's a very short epic to read, by the way. It's sort of dense, poetic. It's not the easiest read, but once you get into it, it's not so difficult either, and there are many wonderful translations. In any case, those of you who have read it, or at some point, may remember that it's essentially the story of King Gilgamesh. He's the king of city of Uruk, and he's not a very good king. He's sort of out of control, an unruly ruler, and which is why the gods decide to create a sidekick for him to sort of rein him in. And this sidekick is called Enkidu. Now, initially, this Enkidu lives in the wilderness. He's really a kind of wildling. He drinks with the animals, he lives with animals, he eats raw food, he wears no clothes. So he's not really human yet. And he, in the beginning of the story, he has to be literally seduced by a woman into the city. And the city is very proud of the city walls. In fact, King Gilgamesh has rebuilt the city walls. And so we have in the beginning of the epic a clear distinction, essentially between civilization and wilderness. And if you live in the wilderness the way Enkidu did, you're not really human, you're like an animal. And it's only when Enkidu is brought into the city that he starts to wear clothes, he starts to eat cooked and processed foods, he starts to drink not water, but beer made from barley, and he becomes fully human. Now, the reason why I'm insisting on this is that the Epic of Gilgamesh is also, and writing in general, is the product, as I said, of the first writing revolution, the invention of writing. And this in turn is the product of the urban revolution. So these cities in Mesopotamia are really among the first cities in the world. And the Epic of Gilgamesh actually starts the very beginning of the epic, a kind of preamble, gives you a tour of the city. Here's the city wall made out of clay bricks. Here are the houses, incredibly dense, so many people living together. The epic even mentions the clay pits from which clay has been harvested. So it's clearly very proud of the fact that this is sort of one of these early urban spaces. And the King Gilgamesh is the builder or rebuilder and protector of this urban space. So part of this urban space then is to define itself against the wilderness. So this is the first thing that's maybe worth noting here. But then we come to the main sort of adventure part of the epic, where King Gilgamesh and his now civilized sidekick Enkidu, they leave the city, they go out in the city, and they go to kill a monster. And that's great. That's sort of that's what we expect from epic heroes, that they go out and kill monsters, and they go and they kill the monster Humbaba. Now, as I said, this is sort of a mainstay of epic literature, this killing of the monster, except if you look closely, and you actually don't even have to look that closely, it's quite on the surface of the text. Once the monster is dead, you realize why they have gone to kill the monster. And it turns out that this monster was the guardian of the forest. And as soon as the monster is dead, the two start to chop down all the trees. And you realize they are on a logging expedition. And they're on a logging expedition because if you want to build cities, you need logs for doors and roofs. and other parts of houses that can't be built from clay. And since we are in the middle of an urban revolution in Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia has already been more or less deforested, which is why Gilgamesh and Enkidu have to go further and further in order to get logs for their city. So in other words, what we are witnessing here is resource extraction for urban living. And so I think that's sort of this, once I realized that, it really blew my mind. And I realized that this earliest written record of human activity, in a way, is a record of resource extraction for city building. And that it's fascinating to me that this epic shows us that. It doesn't, hide that, but in some sense, it's also justifies it, in that, as I mentioned, the epic is so proud of the city space, and it begins with this tour of the city. And once the epic comes to an end, that opening preamble basically gets repeated verbatim, and we get one more time a city tour, the city walls, the clay pits, and basically the houses that were made of clay and timber. So I think this gives you a little bit of a sense of how worthwhile it can be to read very ancient literature, and how relevant it is now. This is before oil, but it is at the beginning of the urban revolution, and the kind of resource extraction that is necessary for it. So this is sort of an example then of how one can use that much longer and broader canon of world literature, really, of written stories from all around the world, as a kind of record of how we humans have been thinking about our relationship to the environment, how often resource extraction is part of that story. And in some sense, I guess you could say that it shows just what we're up against with climate change, not just that our current economic and system of natural resources is based on it and dependent on it, but also that these stories that we keep telling each other and retelling, and have been retelling for thousands of years, have instilled in us a certain mindset that we now have to, I think, both recognize, and this is sort of one reason for this exercise, and we have to recognize it in order, I think, to change it. And here we are at the sort of second part of the book, the second purpose of the book. So one part was basically how to read the canon of world literature with an eye towards climate change. And the second question is, well, now that we understand just how deep some of these problematic stories really go, what kind of stories should we tell? And it's in that second part of this little book that I sort of try to kick into a much more practical or applied mode, if you will, and basically trying to see what kind of lessons can we draw from this history, and what kinds of stories are there to be told, or how should we approach storytelling for the future. And here I want to develop a couple of perspectives on storytelling. The first is story types. What kinds of stories have we been telling about the environment? And I already mentioned the flood stories, these kind of apocalyptic disaster stories that have been around since the story of the flood, so since the earliest stories. And I think there it's clear to me that these apocalyptic disaster stories that right now perhaps dominate the discourse maybe aren't the most helpful. And and it's interesting, with a couple of colleagues, we did a essay writing, or a writing competition with Harvard undergraduate students about climate change. And the winner of that competition just happened a few weeks ago, was actually a writer who is a comic writer. And he made a very powerful pitch for comedy to be used much more often in climate change than it has hitherto been. Not because climate change is haha funny, but because comedy is actually very good at describing everyday life, the obstacles. In comedy, people bump into each other and bump into the world, and to deal with constraints and sort of the complicated aspects of everyday life. And to the extent that we need to change our everyday life and habits are very important for comedy. He made a great, I think, pitch for comedy, at least not always to default to the sort of apocalyptic scenarios that can also, I think, instill can paralyze people, or feel like, well, if it's all going to hell, then it's too late to do anything. So much more broadening of the kinds of stories we should tell. So story types is one way of looking at stories. The other category I want to introduce that strikes me as relevant for telling stories about the environment and climate change is agency. Now, all stories have an agent or several agents. The Epic of Gilgamesh has these two friends who roam the world and kill monsters and fell trees and bring back timber to build cities. And in fact, based on mostly other epics, scholars and popular writers have tried to extract from all of these stories the kinds of heroes that populate them. And the most extreme version of this is Joseph Campbell, who wrote this book, A Hero with 1,000 Faces, where he basically tried to combine all of these hero stories into one scheme, where the hero leaves home and he has certain obstacles to surmount, and finds him or herself in different circumstances and gets help and then returns home transformed. This book, Here with 1,000 Faces, particularly, as some of you may know, influential in Hollywood, which is why it's worth thinking about that. Now, when it comes to climate change, I think you'll probably agree with me that relying or hoping for this one hero to appear and save us all is not going to happen. Which is why I've been starting to think about collective agents. Clearly, climate change is a collective matter, and we need to think of ways of activating collectively. Now, when I go back and look at world literature, and not just fiction, but influential storytelling of the last 4,000 years, there's actually one text that, and maybe it's a surprising text for some, that I think about when I think about models for texts that come up with collective agents, and that's the Communist Manifesto. Why? Because that's essentially what the Communist Manifesto did. It of course observed the effects of the Industrial Revolution, the impoverished workers, but it didn't just describe these workers as victims of the Industrial Revolution. It describes them as essentially a new kind of collective protagonist in world history. That's one of the reasons why the Communist Manifesto became such an influential text, is because it tells a story. The first sentence is the history of all hitherto existing societies, a history of class struggle. And it then begins to basically give an account of world history based on this idea of the class struggle. And late in that story appears a new agent, namely the proletariat. So the proletariat here is not just these impoverished victims and workers. The Communist Manifesto sort of turns that around and tries to imagine those helpless, agentless people as a new kind of agent. And this is, I think, an interesting model. It's one of the models, the only ones I can really think of a powerful, a collective agent. So I think there's something maybe we can learn from that. Now, the Communist Manifesto was written by two people, Marx and Engels, but it was written on behalf of this very small communist league in London, mostly comprised of German immigrants, so a very minor, very, very insignificant kind of group of people. But they commissioned Marx and Engels to write this manifesto for them. And when I think of the current situation of the world and the challenge of climate change, it's very clear that this commissioning 2 or 3 or 1 brilliant person to write this manifesto for climate change is not going to happen either. There have been some manifestos, but not quite the right ones. In any case, this has in turn led me to think not just about collective agents, but collective acts of storytelling. And here I have, again, gone back, as that's how I think, gone back into these 4,000 years of literary history to look for models for collective acts of storytelling. And what I have settled on here as an interesting model are these story collections that sort of sprung up in different parts of the world in the late antiquity and the Middle Ages, from the great Indian story collection, one of the many Indian story collections, Panchatantra, to perhaps the most well-known 1001 Nights, but there are really countless other story collections. And what they essentially are collecting stories from different sources, often from different cultural spheres. These stories wander in and out of different story collections. Some of the stories appear in one story collection, then they appear in the 1001 Nights, then they appear in Chaucer. But they're often framed, and this framing, in a sense, focuses these collections onto a particular problems. And so this, has strikes me as an interesting, potentially, model for how we should approach storytelling now, namely to think about collective agents rather than just individual agents, and maybe look for models like the Communist Manifesto, but maybe I'm sure there are other models out there as well that I haven't thought of. And these story collections that gather different individual stories told from different points of views and from different cultural perspectives, but gather them and focus them through maybe framing devices onto our problems here. So this is sort of the gist of this book and what I want to talk to you about here. So on the one hand, this deep look into literary history, really treating the history of literature, call it world literature, as a kind of record of human storytelling and activity, and to realize what is useful about that history of storytelling, but also what is problematic, like, for example, when stories justify resource extraction of one way or another, and recognizing, for example, how deeply literature over the last 4,000 years has been written from the point of view of city living, as in this very early case. The kind of romantic literature that romanticizes nature, and we have to return to nature, is a very recent vintage. If you take these 4,000 years, overwhelming number of these texts are produced for cities, in cities, written down by scribes living in cities. And so I think that's one reason why there's a sort of deeply built urban prejudice, if you want to call it that, built into the history of literature. And that's important to become aware of. And then on the other hand, the more applied, so what should we do now kind of question, and thinking about different story types and how to structure stories and forms of storytelling in order to really rewire our brains in a certain way. Because I started talking about this maybe truism that we are storytelling animals, and I suppose another way of saying this is that because stories are so important in how we see the world, it's important to realize where they come from, become sort of aware of the stories and the choices that go into them, that we keep retelling and that are sort of floating around our minds. And on the other hand, to think about how to tell new stories, because that's, I think, what we need to do. So thank you very much for listening. I'd love to have to start a conversation with you about these topics, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was fantastic. We have a couple of minutes. We have about 20 minutes left before we end the panel. And for those of you who've had a chance to ask a couple of questions through the Q&A, please go ahead and continue to ask your questions. I'm here to moderate and help to sort of send those questions on to Martin. So thank you again, Martin. That was fantastic. So the first question is from Etta. She asks, Martin mentioned Mayan stories. Are there any instances of climate crisis in those?
Thank you so much. And yes, so, well, first of all, Mayan civilization is this really interesting, actually, test case of climate degradation, because the large Mayan cities and temples that exist in what's now Guatemala and southern Mexico sort of reached a peak around 800, 900 AD. And then many of these cities were abandoned. So this is, hundreds of years before the devastating interruption of Mayan civilization by the arrival of the conquistadors. So there was something, and so the Mayan civilization is often one of these cases of in these kind of histories about the rise and fall of civilizations. The Easter Islands are another one. And so there are many theories about that, why there was somehow that act. And so one theory has to do with too much dependence on maize and corn as a main staple, and that staple couldn't sustain a growing urban population. And so there aren't in the Popol Vuh, for example, there isn't a story of decline that pinpoints maize. So it's not that explicit, but it is a text where maize is seen as the main staple, and a lot of attention is paid to that agricultural product. And you can see how central it is for this civilization. And that, by the way, is a kind of mode of reading that I do in sort of mini examples with other texts too. So every time a literary text starts to focus on agriculture, which so many of them do because our lives depend on it, it's really worth paying a very close attention to that, and how different forms of agriculture, as well as hunting and fishing and so on and so forth, how they are represented, what kinds of activities and culture is sort of developed around it. And that's definitely the case with the Popol Vuh, but not so much from within this text, but from what we know about the civilization. There is this fascinating question of why were these incredible cities abandoned, and it's also, we are still, the Popol Vuh was only deciphered a couple of decades ago, so this is very recent, and we are still learning about Mayan civilization. It's now all overgrown by jungle. But I spent a little bit of time in a Mayan village and was taken on tours, and you walk through the jungle and you see sort of little piles of stones scattered all everywhere. And you realize that this was all once sort of a network of settlements and urban spaces, and they're sort of new infrared aerial photography that keep discovering under the the canopy of the jungle just the extent of this civilization. And some of it was devastated, of course, by the arrival of the Spaniards and the diseases and the exploitation that resulted from it. And the Spaniards also tried to destroy the Mayan books. So they realized that this scribal culture was a real form of power for the Mayans, of course, also connected to religion. And so they tried to eliminate Mayan civilization, tear it out by the root. And this root was the written books. And so this Popol Vuh that I mentioned only survived because a couple of anonymous Mayan scribes were very, very clever. They realized, of course, that their civilization was under lethal threat from the outside. And they realized that they would lose. And they realized that their writing system, Mayan glyphs, would probably fall out of use and become illegible, which they did. And so what they did in order to preserve the story of the Popol Vuh was to go underground and to write down this story in their language, but using the Roman alphabet, so the alphabet of the victors, because they knew that way they were essentially, I guess you could say, future-proofing their text. And this is how it survived, based on this one version of the story that was written in the alphabet brought by the Spaniards. So yeah, I mean, as you can see, I could go on forever. So thank you for this question. But the Mayans are a fascinating sort of culture for so many things, including writing.
That was a great question. Next question from Claudia. They write, what do you think of the emergence of the new solar punk genre in science fiction in relation to climate change? That is a focus on the invention of a better or more optimistic world, like an inversion of the dystopian or apocalyptic story type. And they also write, I think this new genre might be highlighting exactly this idea of society coming together rather than a hero fighting for us during the apocalypse, which seems like an interesting change in narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is more of a comment than a question, and I think the question really sort of answered itself. I think that I totally agree. There are it's one of the ways in which I think science fiction of that particular genre is really interesting right now, and where I think a lot of these big picture. I always, I mean, I read a lot of science fiction, but I also feel like a kind of a sort of elective affinity between the kind of thinking in terms of thousands of years that I try to do looking back is what, science fiction tries to do going forward. So yeah, so thank you very much for that suggestion. I think that's feel very simpatico with that.
This next question from Sophie is, were there any medieval stories you came across that dealt with the problematization of favoring urbanization instead of nature?
Yeah, I mean, yes. In fact, I would say almost all stories do that before Romanticism. So, for almost all, the entire human record of written stories shows that nature is either seen as a threat, it's a dangerous place. If you think of the Arthurian romances, you go into the woods and all kinds of dangerous things happen there. Or it's a source of danger, or it is it's a space outside civilization that needs to be civilized and controlled in one way, or it's a resource from which something can be extracted, like a monster, or in a way. And this is why there are so many medieval stories where, where the knight goes into the woods, kills the monster. And that's for me very much like that Gilgamesh story, except that Gilgamesh sort of literally spells out why you want to do it, namely to then control the forest. And that means you can cut down trees, you can turn it into agricultural land, and so on and so forth. So yes, there are lots of medieval stories, and as I mentioned, I think only briefly in passing, so a good chance to say it again, that these story collections that I mentioned, like 1001 Nights, when I did this big anthology, it was very interesting to see when certain story types dominate. And I would say that one of the most interesting and dominant genres of the whole Middle Ages are these story collections. And in Europe, in the Middle East, in South Asia. So thank very much so.
The next question is about eco-criticism. So the question from Nikita is, could you please describe the second wave of eco-criticism and how to interpret a text with an eco-critical lens?
Well, so I think eco-criticism, in some sense, has, this is a broad generalization, there are lots of exceptions, but eco-criticism, certainly as it's been, as it has emerged in the US in the last few decades, and maybe the UK too, has focused, there are a couple of touchstone texts, like in the US, it's Thoreau's Walden, and it's a very interesting text, or the text of the Romantics, going out to nature, valuing nature, or texts like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, a powerful nonfiction text that talks about chemicals and so on and so forth. So I mean, there's a interesting canon that eco-criticism has focused on. There are other aspects to it. There's a kind of, if you will, post-human strain that focuses on relationship of humans and other animals or nature, for example. And again, that's sometimes in fiction, that's sometimes nonfiction. So those and much more recently, there's an emphasis, and I think that's also very interesting, on indigenous storytelling. Is a kind of thinking about that resonates with me very much. I mentioned earlier that when you study 4,000 years of writing, you also think about what's not written down and what the kind of oral storytelling that happens below or outside the domain of writing. So I think there's a sort of eco-criticism version of that too, especially in the US and Canada. So this is how I would sort of broadly define eco-criticism as it's practiced. If some audience members have other things to contribute, I invite them to do that. So, but as I said, what they all have in common is this focus on relatively recent literature. And so my invitation to this field is, in a way, to be much broader. And to what I develop in the book is sort of it's a fancy word, reading protocol. It's sort of what to pay attention to in texts that aren't obvious, don't present themselves as eco-critical texts or as part of environmental literature, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, like the Popol Vuh, like these story collections. And so what to focus on, and one of these things I've already mentioned is anytime agriculture is mentioned, or how texts define the border, sometimes literally a wall between civilization and wilderness. And so there are a couple of sort of points that if you put pressure, you put up a little pressure or focus on them, I think you can get a lot of out essentially any text of world literature in some sense. Yeah, so that's thanks for the question.
This next question is going to shift gears a little bit to thinking about how storytelling is a common factor in dealing with nature, and is the way that the West deals with it and the way that the East deals with it sort of different? Do you think that that's something that happens in the West and the East in their dealings with storytelling?
I think yes, although I would also not just think of West and East as the sort of one binary, but in part I just mentioned the focus on indigenous storytelling is that there are many ways of and many local ways of thinking about that. I just last month I was down in Florida talking about this book, and I had a lot of time, spent a lot of time with a scholar who focuses, Juan Carlos Galeano, who collects folk tales from the Amazon basin, and really fascinating work there, this water world, and how oral stories and folk tales from that part of the world, what kind of view of nature and living with nature they reveal. But the distinction between West and East does matter. Amitav Ghosh has written about this very eloquently recently in a book of nonfiction called The Nutmeg's Curse. So maybe some of the listeners will know that. So yes, so I think that this is part of my plea to really look at world literature and different storytelling traditions, and not only a sort of narrow canon, in the case of US academia, mostly US literature. Not that there's great and inventive literature, but I think we need to get much broader geographically in terms of story types, and also much deeper, so go much further back, as I'm trying to sort of invite people to do.
That's great. The next two questions are sort of related to the urban, so I think I might roll them into one question if that's okay. So the question is more or less about whether or not there are differences of perception of climate change in rural and urban, and I suppose also written and oral stories. So how would you differentiate between those two things?
So yeah, I think there are, and that's why it's important not to be only caught up in our mostly urban bubbles. Now, I don't want to sort of schematize and say all urban perception of the environment are X and all rural ones are Y, but it's very important to, especially, as I said, especially since literature, even today, all the publishing houses are in New York City and London, with a few exceptions. All the editors live there. Most of the writers live there or go there, are shaped by that culture. And so if you look at the marketplace of world literature right now, it's just amazing how these relatively few urban centers really dominate. And so this, as I said, this very deep-seated urban prejudice, I think, is manifests itself in all kinds of ways. That doesn't mean that there aren't, publishers aren't eager then to publish books about other spaces, but they're always looking at them through the lens of their lifestyle choices, and so do I. So that's why I think this collective acts of storytelling and thinking really about these different perspectives, whether it's West, East, or urban, rural, or any other act, or settler, indigenous. I mean, I don't think I would privilege one of these binaries, and perhaps we would also at some point move beyond these binaries, but we also need to, I think that's perhaps the point of pointing out these binaries, is just to remind ourselves how much we're often caught in particular storytelling traditions that dominate, and that I think becoming aware of that, and then deliberately seeking out other story traditions, like for example the ones of the Amazon basin I just mentioned. I think I have that book somewhere. I'll hold it into the camera. I guess I can't find it right now. Anyway, Juan Carlos Galeano, Folk Tales of the Amazon. I really recommend it.
Okay, we just have a couple of minutes left, so I think I'll just read out these last couple of questions, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. So one of the questions is kind of about the heroes, villains, victims configuration. And do you think that while we're finding the villains, when it comes to environmental concerns, we maybe overemphasize them or forget that we need to be finding the solutions? And then the last question is kind of rotated or kind of coming off of the other one that you answered before about eco-criticism. It's what is the impact of eco-critical study of the past?
Yeah, no, both are really great questions and ones that I spend a lot of time sort of worrying about. To take the second one first, the impact. I mean, it's a complicated thing, but one worry I have is that there are wonderful people working in eco-criticism, but in some sense, I think this is part of a larger story about the humanities, where it's become, at least sometimes, one more subfield in the humanities. And we all know that the humanities are declining and that there's something very insular about the humanities sometimes, where this work is then just for other specialists. And one of my worries is precisely that it's not as impactful as it should be. And I know that there are lots of scholars in eco-criticism, especially younger ones, who are very eager who know that that's not good to be just talking to other specialists. But this is, because I become frustrated with the insularity of the humanities and try to write books for a larger audience. I think that was also one ambition in writing the whole book, to in some sense gather some of these insights of eco-criticism and help popularize them, for lack of a better word. So I think it's crucial for the humanities, any form of the humanities, to address the public. We've lost the public by and large, and that's really tragic. It's particularly tragic in the case of eco-criticism, where I think the idea has to be that any work that's being done ultimately has to have some practical or applied. I used this before. Applied is sometimes a dirty word amongst humanists. We don't like to get our hands dirty. I think we need to get our hands dirty. And so the other question about the villains also, I talk a little bit about that towards the end of the book. I agree that we are, I think, somehow too focused on villains. Now, there are real villains. My colleague Naomi Oreskes with Merchants of Doubt, and the way tobacco industry and oil industry literally undermines climate science. There are real villains, but in the end, I think that goes back to, I guess, an earlier conversation about sort of the moralizing tone of the environmental discourse. And maybe sometimes that's important. I wouldn't say that it never is, but I think there's a lot of it. And I don't think that finger pointing and calling people villains is an effective way of convincing them to do something different. But that's, it's not just a problem in environmental politics, but including there. So I agree. And so I think we have to really scrutinize, when are we defaulting to villains? And because ultimately, in varying degrees, this is, I think, another conclusion from this long history of civilization. We are all contributing to climate change one way or another. Some people way more than others, but there's no doubt. Some countries and some industries and there are vast differences. We live in an incredibly unequal world, but ultimately it's a collective problem. And I think that we need to come up with collective solutions.
Well, thank you for leading the charge on rallying the humanities and thinking about this. And thank you so much for this wonderful foray into 4,000 years worth of world literature through an environmental lens. I just want to say thank you so much to Martin Puchner for this wonderful talk, as well as to the AV team and to Sarah and others at the York Festival of Ideas for organizing this panel. And thank you again as well to everyone who's been a part of this webinar today. Big round of applause for Martin. Thank you so much for being here. This was fantastic.
And thank you, Sarah. And you yourself, of course, are a scholar of species extinction. And we had a very wonderful conversation about that and a really important aspect of all of this.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. Thank you so much again, Martin. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good night.